Welcome to the Nameless.
The bell rang at exactly 3 p.m., sharp and metallic, echoing down the hallway like it was letting out a class that no longer existed. That was the moment I realized I wasn't alone in the building. I had been standing in what used to be the science wing, staring at a row of lockers fused shut with rust, when the sound cut through the silence and made my chest tighten. The last class had ended 30 years ago. I knew that. Everyone in town did. Before that afternoon, the old Briarwood Elementary was just another abandoned place on the edge of a dying town. It sat beyond the railroad tracks, half hidden by trees that had grown unchecked since the school shut down. Windows were broken or boarded, the playground equipment had collapsed into itself, and the sign out front was so faded you could barely read the name. I grew up hearing stories about it, but they were never ghost stories.
Just stories about how the mine closed, families moved away, and eventually there weren't enough kids to keep the school open. I moved back to Briarwood when I was 27, after my dad passed and left me the house I grew up in. The town felt smaller than I remembered, a lot quieter. Most of the storefronts on Main Street were empty, and the few people who stayed tended to keep to themselves. I worked remote, so I had too much free time and not much to do with it. Exploring abandoned places became a way to kill the boredom. The school was always on my list, but I put it off, not because I was scared, more because it felt personal. I went there from kindergarten through 4th grade, back when the town still had a future. I remembered the smell of floor cleaner, the way the bell sounded different in winter, duller somehow. When the building closed, they just locked the doors and walked away. No renovation, no demolition. It was like the town forgot it on purpose.
The day I finally went was overcast and warm. I parked my car near the tracks and walked the rest of the way. The front doors were chained, but one of the side entrances had been forced open at some point. Inside, the air smelled stale, like old paper and damp wood. Dust floated in the light coming through broken windows. My footsteps sounded too loud, even when I tried to walk quietly. At first, it was exactly what I expected. Empty classrooms, desks stacked or overturned, posters peeling off the walls, frozen in time with math problems in cursive alphabets. Someone had spray painted their name in the cafeteria, but other than that, there wasn't much evidence of recent visitors. No fresh trash, no footprints. I remember thinking how intact it all felt, like the building was just waiting. I made my way through the first floor slowly, taking pictures on my phone. The gym still had faded lines on the floor.
The library shelves were bare, except for a few ruined books stuck together by moisture. Every now and then, I'd hear the building settle. A creak, a soft pop. Normal sounds for a place this old. I kept telling myself that. It was when I reached the science wing that things started to feel off. The temperature dropped noticeably, enough that I stopped and checked my arms. The windows there were mostly intact, but the light felt dimmer, like it was late afternoon even though it wasn't. I noticed the clocks on the wall as I passed classrooms. Every single one was stopped at 3. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at one of them. The second hand was bent, pressed against the minute hand. I tried to laugh it off. Power must have gone out at dismissal time on the last day. It made sense. It still bothered me. That was when the bell rang. It wasn't distorted or broken sounding. It was clear and full, echoing through the halls exactly the way I remembered. I jumped, my phone slipping in my hand. For a split second, my brain tried to convince me it was some kind of audio glitch. a recording, a prank. But the sound moved. It rolled past me, down the hallway, bouncing off lockers and doors. I waited for it to stop. It did, after the usual length of time. Too long to be a malfunction, too deliberate. I called out, asking if anyone was there. My voice sounded wrong in that space, thin and nervous. No answer. The silence afterward felt heavier than before, like the building was listening. I told myself to leave. I even turned around and took a few steps back the way I came. Then I heard footsteps. They were faint, almost lost under the creaks of the building, but they had a rhythm to them. Slow, unhurried, coming from the far end of the hall. I stood there, frozen, trying to decide if I was actually hearing anything at all. The steps stopped when I stopped listening for them, which somehow made it worse. I waited a full minute before moving again. When I did, the steps started back up, matching me. Not echoing, matching. I ducked into the nearest classroom and closed the door as quietly as I could. The room smelled like mildew and chalk dust. Sunlight filtered through the blinds in thin strips. I crouched by the teacher's desk, my heart pounding hard enough that I was sure it could be heard outside. The footsteps passed the door. I saw the shadow under the gap move by, then stop. I held my breath. After a moment, the shadow shifted again and moved on. I stayed there longer than I can comfortably admit. Eventually, I convinced myself I was overreacting. Old buildings made noises. Someone else could have been exploring, just as startled as I was. I eased the door open and looked into the hallway. It was empty. I left the classroom and headed toward the exit, keeping my pace steady. I didn't want to run. Halfway there, I noticed something I hadn't before. The lockers along the wall were dented and scratched, like they'd been kicked repeatedly. In one spot, a classroom door had deep gouges around the handle, wood splintered outward. I tried not to think about what could have made marks like that. As I passed the main office, I glanced inside. The door was open. I hadn't noticed that earlier. On the desk sat a stack of papers, yellowed but neatly arranged. Attendance sheets, names I recognized, my own, printed in careful block letters. Present. I backed away slowly, my mouth dry. That was when I heard the bell ring again. Once. Short. Like a warning. The building felt different after that. The air was heavier, harder to breathe. I could hear things I hadn't before. A low murmur, like distant voices behind walls. Lockers creaking open and shut somewhere out of sight. The sound of a chair scraping across a floor above me. I broke into a jog. I didn't care how loud I was anymore. I just wanted out. The side exit was closer, but when I reached it, the door was closed. The gap I'd come through earlier was gone, the frame warped inward like it had never been forced open at all. I stood there, staring, my thoughts scrambling. I told myself it was panic, that I'd misremembered. I turned and headed for the front doors instead. That was when I saw the children. They weren't standing in the hallway, not exactly. It was more like impressions, movement in the corners of my vision, the sound of shoes on tile, laughter that cut off too abruptly. I never saw a face clearly, and that felt intentional, like my mind was being spared something. As I moved, the school around me shifted. Bulletin boards were suddenly full again. Artwork lined the walls, crayon drawings curling at the edges. Inside, desks were filled, heads bent over papers. A teacher stood at the front, writing on the board with her back to me. The bell rang. Every head turned toward me at once. I don't remember leaving the building, not clearly. I remember sunlight and falling onto gravel, and the sound of the bell muffled by distance. I remember driving home with my hands shaking so badly I had to pull over twice. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. Every day at 3 p.m., I heard the bell, sometimes faint, sometimes close enough that it made me flinch. I asked around town, careful not to sound crazy.
A few people admitted they'd heard it too, once or twice. Always at 3, always from the direction of the school. A week later, the building burned down. An electrical fire, they said. No one questioned it. There was nothing left but a blackened foundation and the rusted frame of the sign out front. The bell still rings. Every afternoon, at exactly 3 p.m., I hear it. Not from the school, from inside my house, from somewhere just out of sight, letting out a class that never learned how to leave.